All right, let's talk about James Monroe. You probably know the name, right? The Monroe Doctrine? But his story is so much bigger than that. We're talking about the fifth U.S. president, a man who literally helped draw the lines on the map that define America today. But he also stood at this incredibly dangerous crossroads, trying to hold a young nation together as it was threatening to just completely tear itself apart.
Not a spot on his soul. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. Coming from Thomas Jefferson, that is an absolutely incredible endorsement. It paints this picture of a leader known for his unwavering integrity. And believe me, he was going to need every single ounce of it because America was facing crises that would test the very soul of the nation.
And that's a really key point you have to understand about him. Monroe was the last of the founding fathers to be president. This is a guy who fought in the Revolution. He knew Washington, Jefferson, all of them as colleagues. He was this living, breathing link between the country's birth and its explosive, kind of uncertain growth into a real continental power.
Now, Monroe's time in office is often called the era of good feelings, which, honestly, is deeply ironic. Why? Because just below the surface, a massive crisis was brewing that threatened to rip the country right in two. And the fight was all about slavery's expansion into the new Western territories. It was about to explode.
And here on the screen, you can see that fundamental split. It's like two different Americas were taking shape. In the North, you've got this industrializing economy, built on factories and trade. Meanwhile, the South was agricultural, and its entire way of life, its whole economy, was built on the backs of enslaved people. Both were looking west, and Missouri became the battleground where these two completely different visions for America were going to collide head-on.
So what was the solution? Well, the answer, championed by Monroe's administration, was what we now call the Missouri Compromise. And you gotta understand, this wasn't some permanent fix. It was a really high-stakes legislative balancing act, basically, designed to pull the nation back from the brink of falling apart.
So here's how they worked out the delicate math. First, Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state. That appeased the South. But to keep the balance of power in Congress, Maine would be admitted as a free state. And then they drew a literal line in the sand, the 36-degree 30-minute parallel. From then on, slavery would be banned in all future territories north of that line. It was a fragile truce, a temporary patch that basically just kicked the can down the road toward the Civil War.
At the exact same time Monroe was navigating this crisis at home, another storm was brewing overseas. All across Latin America, colonies were winning their independence from Spain. And the old monarchies of Europe? They were seriously considering stepping in to reclaim them.
Now, Britain, who saw a chance for new trade partners, suggested a joint U.S.-British warning to the rest of Europe. But Monroe's Secretary of State, the brilliant John Quincy Adams, he argued for a much bolder path. He said America shouldn't be a tiny little cockboat just trailing behind the mighty British warship. No, it should make its own powerful, independent declaration.
And Monroe took his advice. The result was one of the most famous and frankly audacious statements in American foreign policy history, the Monroe Doctrine. It was a simple, bold declaration to all the powers of Europe that basically said, "This hemisphere is ours. Stay out." The whole thing was built on four core ideas. First, the Americas are closed for business. No more European colonies here. Second, the U.S. promised not to interfere with colonies that already existed. Third, and this was the really big one, any attempt by Europe to mess with the new independent nations in the hemisphere would be seen as a hostile act against the United States itself. And finally, we'll stay out of your European wars. For such a young country to make a statement this bold, it was incredible.
In this new, bold foreign policy, it was all about securing America's own backyard, right? Well, that went hand in hand with an aggressive push to expand its own borders. Throughout his entire career, James Monroe was a key player in dramatically increasing the physical size of the United States. I mean, his impact on the nation's map was just immense. He helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase under Jefferson, which, boom, doubled the size of the country overnight. As president, his administration set the northern border with Canada at the 49th parallel, and then in 1819 he acquired all of Florida from Spain. He was literally drawing America's future on the map.
And the deal for Florida was pretty shrewd. The U.S. didn't actually pay Spain directly. Instead, it agreed to cover $5 million in claims its own citizens had against Spain. So, in return, America got Florida, and just as importantly, a defined western border that stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean. This was really the first official step toward making the United States a true coast-to-coast nation.
But, and this is a huge but, We can't really understand Monroe without confronting the deepest, most difficult paradox of his life and his era, the institution of slavery. This was a man who championed liberty on a hemispheric scale while at the same time participating in human bondage right at home.
The contradiction here is just staggering. On one hand, publicly, Monroe called slavery an evil. He supported a society to send freed slaves to Africa. The capital of Liberia, Monrovia, is even named for him. But on the other hand, his private reality? He enslaved dozens of people his entire life. He brought them with him to work in the White House. He's sold human beings to pay off his own debts. This conflict isn't just a footnote. It is absolutely central to understanding both the man and his time.
So that's what we're left with. James Monroe was, without a doubt, an architect of the American hemisphere, a leader who shaped the nation's power and its borders in ways we still see today. But his legacy forces us, it really forces us, to ask a very difficult question. How do we reconcile a grand vision for freedom abroad with the brutal reality of bondage at home? And that right there is the paradox of James Monroe.